The luxury boutique, nestled within the city's high-end shopping district, gleamed with an opulence that spoke to the wealth of its patrons. Bright, carefully placed lights reflected off the polished surfaces, creating a dazzling effect that made every jewelry display look like it was suspended in stardust. Rows of sparkling diamonds, gold chains, and finely crafted watches sat in gleaming glass cases, each piece meticulously positioned to highlight its unique allure. The entire atmosphere exuded refinement and exclusivity, a place designed to cater to those who could afford the very best. The door swung open gently, and in stepped a young black girl, no more than 13, her eyes wide with a mix of wonder and determination. Dressed in a simple yet elegant outfit, a modest blouse, and a well-kept skirt with neat shoes, she did not look like the typical customer in a store like this, and her presence immediately drew the attention of those around her. She carried herself with a mix of nervousness and excitement, as if she was stepping into a dream. Her name was Alyssa Johnson, and today she had a special mission to find the perfect gift for her mother's upcoming birthday. Alyssa's fingers fidgeted slightly as she approached one of the displays, where a delicate necklace with a small, sparkling gemstone caught her eye. Her heart swelled with joy at the thought of surprising her mother, who had always put others first and rarely treated herself to anything luxurious. To Alyssa, this store felt like a gateway to another world, a place where she could pick out something truly beautiful and meaningful, a token of love for her mother. Across the room, however, the boutique's senior salesman, Peter Collins, watched Alyssa with a mixture of suspicion and disdain. Peter was a white man in his early 50s, with a meticulously groomed appearance that matched the store's refined aesthetic. His silver hair was neatly combed back, and his suit was impeccable, tailored to perfection, signaling his long tenure and status within the store. Peter had been with the boutique for over 20 years and had developed an intuitive sense, or so he believed, for spotting problematic customers. He had seen it all: the wealthy, the powerful, the occasionally eccentric, but he had little patience for those he deemed out of place. From the moment Alyssa walked through the door, Peter's eyes were on her. He felt an immediate distrust, a gut reaction born not of Alyssa's actions, but of her appearance. In his mind, a young black girl alone in such an exclusive establishment could mean only one thing: trouble. He convinced himself that he had encountered this type of situation countless times before: individuals who didn't belong coming into the store with no intention of buying, perhaps even with dishonest motives. Peter's face tightened as he continued to observe Alyssa from across the room. Every small gesture, every glance she made towards the jewelry displays seemed to confirm his suspicions. She's probably casing the place, he muttered under his breath, a mixture of annoyance and contempt flickering in his expression. Peter's bias was so ingrained, so quietly embedded within his worldview, that he didn't even question it. He saw himself as the last line of defense, the one who ensured that the boutique maintained its standards and protected its valuable merchandise. Alyssa, oblivious to Peter's watchful gaze, was engrossed in examining the jewelry, her fingers brushing over the glass case with a childlike wonder. She was careful not to touch anything directly, knowing how expensive everything must be. She moved slowly, taking in the intricate details of each piece, trying to imagine which one would be perfect for her mother. Her face lit up as she spotted a delicate bracelet, its gentle curves adorned with small, sparkling stones. She leaned in closer, a smile breaking across her face as she pictured her mother wearing it. Peter, meanwhile, had seen enough. He couldn't stand by and let this intruder linger any longer. He walked over briskly, his steps firm, the sound of his polished shoes echoing through the store. As he approached, he noticed Alyssa's hand hovering near the display case, and his suspicions solidified into certainty. Without a second thought, he decided to confront her. "Excuse me, young lady," Peter said, his voice laced with a forced politeness that barely concealed his irritation. Alyssa looked up, startled, her moment of joy interrupted by the cold tone in his voice. She blinked, trying to process his sudden approach, as he positioned himself firmly between her and the display case, effectively blocking her view. "Yes," Alyssa replied softly, taken aback by his abrupt manner. She didn't understand why he was addressing her this way, but she maintained her composure, hoping that whatever misunderstanding had arisen could be quickly cleared up. Peter's gaze was unyielding, a hard, judgmental stare that seemed to pierce right through her. "Can I help you with something?" he asked, though his tone made it clear that he doubted she had any legitimate reason for being there. "These items are quite valuable, you know." Alyssa felt her cheeks flush slightly. She sensed the implication in his words, and it made her feel small and unwelcome. Yet, she gathered her courage, determined not to let him ruin her experience. "I'm looking for a gift," she replied, her voice steady despite her discomfort. "For my mum's birthday." "Cray." Peter raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "A gift," he repeated the word with a hint of condescension, as if the idea itself were absurd. His gaze traveled over her attire, his mind jumping to all the wrong conclusions. "Do you have someone here with you?" he asked, his eyes scanning the room, as if expecting an adult to come over and claim her. "No, I'm here by myself," Alyssa replied, growing more uncomfortable with each passing second. She hadn't expected to be treated with such suspicion. In her excitement, she hadn't considered that someone might look at her as if she didn't belong. Peter clicked his tongue softly, shaking his head in disapproval. "This isn't exactly the type of store where browsing is encouraged," he said, choosing his words carefully but still making his meaning painfully clear. "Most of our customers come here with serious intentions to buy." Alyssa's confidence wavered. She looked around, noticing for the first time the glances from other customers, some curious, some indifferent, and others perhaps sympathetic. She wanted to stand her ground, to insist that she had every right to be there, but Peter's imposing presence and patronizing tone made it difficult. She felt outnumbered, out of place, and suddenly very alone. I just wanted to see if there was something my mum would like," she said quietly, almost apologetically, as if she were admitting to a crime. The sparkle in her eyes dimmed, replaced by a growing sense of unease. Her fingers trembled slightly as she clasped her hands together, trying to maintain her dignity. Peter leaned forward, his face tightening into a stern expression. "Well, if you're not buying anything," he said, "it might be best if you left. This is not the kind of place for window shopping." He paused, letting his words sink in, watching as her shoulders slumped under the weight of his thinly veiled insult. Alyssa's heart sank. All her excitement, her joy was quickly turning into a feeling of humiliation. She opened her mouth to protest, to tell him that she had saved up her allowance for this very moment, but the words caught in her throat. Peter's piercing gaze and dismissive attitude made her feel as though she were doing something wrong just by standing there. At that moment, as if by fate, the boutique door swung open once more, and in walked a tall, confident black man, dressed sharply in a suit that conveyed both professionalism and strength. His presence was commanding, his posture straight, and his expression thoughtful yet focused. This was Marcus Johnson, Alyssa's father, who had just finished a business meeting nearby and decided to check in on his daughter. Marcus noticed Alyssa immediately, and his keen eyes took in the scene, her downcast expression, the towering figure of the salesman looming over her, and the unmistakable look of distress on her face. He could tell in an instant that something was wrong, and a flicker of anger sparked within him. But instead of rushing over, Marcus held back for a moment, choosing to observe the interaction before making his presence known. Peter, still unaware of Marcus's arrival, continued his interrogation, oblivious to the storm that was quietly brewing right behind him. As Marcus Johnson stood silently behind Peter, his eyes remained fixed on his daughter, Alyssa. He could see the tension in her small frame, the way her shoulders were drawn inward, as if she were trying to make herself invisible. His heart tightened at the sight. He knew that look. It was the expression of someone who felt they were being judged, belittled, and unwelcome experiences he himself had faced too many times. He took a slow, calming breath, keeping his emotions in check. This wasn't the time for anger, it was a time for strategy. Peter, still oblivious to Marcus's presence, continued his quiet intimidation of Alyssa. He leaned in slightly, his voice a low whisper laced with condescension. "You don't look like someone who can afford anything in this store, young lady," he murmured, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized her with renewed disdain. "Why don't you go find someplace else that's more suited to you?" Alyssa's eyes widened, a mix of confusion and hurt flashing across her face. She looked up at Peter, her mouth slightly open, as if she was struggling to find the right words to respond. "But I just wanted to look. I wasn't going to touch anything," she stammered, her voice small and wavering. She couldn't understand why he was treating her this way. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, feeling as though she were guilty of some invisible crime. Peter's lips curled into a faint, dismissive smile. "That's the thing with you kids," he said, shaking his head. "You think you can just wander in any way you like and do as you please. But this isn't the mall, sweetheart. This is a place of business, and we don't tolerate loitering." The word loitering struck Alyssa like a slap. She had only heard it used in serious contexts, usually about people who were up to no good, people who were causing trouble. It hurt her deeply that this man would see her that way, as though she were a nuisance, an intruder in a place where she didn't belong. She could feel the sting of tears welling up, but she swallowed hard, determined not to let them show. Her father had always taught her to stand tall, to face challenges with dignity. But in this moment it was hard. Marcus decided it was time to intervene. He took a measured step forward, clearing his throat as he came to stand beside his daughter. Peter flinched, clearly startled by the unexpected appearance of this tall, imposing man. Marcus's calm but commanding presence immediately shifted the dynamics of the room. He looked at Peter with a gaze so steady and unyielding that the salesman, for the first time, seemed to falter. "Is there a problem here?" Marcus asked, his voice deep and steady, carrying a subtle undertone of authority that was impossible to ignore. Peter hesitated, his face paling slightly as he processed the situation. In that brief moment he weighed his options, trying to decide how to proceed. He didn't want to lose face in front of this stranger, but something about Marcus's composed demeanor made him feel suddenly exposed. Yet, Peter's pride and his ingrained biases pushed him to press on, to justify his actions. "Oh, I was just explaining to your daughter that this store isn't a playground," Peter replied, attempting to sound casual, though his voice held a faint edge of defensiveness. "We have certain standards here, and we can't allow people to wander around without clear intentions to buy." He shot a pointed glance at Alyssa, as if to underscore his point. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression neutral but inquisitive. "Certain standards," he repeated, his voice laced with a quiet intensity. "And what standards, exactly, made you feel the need to single out my daughter?" Peter's jaw tightened as he felt the scrutiny of Marcus's question. "Well, I mean, she's a young girl, alone," he said, struggling to maintain his composure. "And if I'm being honest, she doesn't exactly look like our usual clientele. We have to protect our merchandise, you understand." Alyssa looked up at her father, Her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and nervousness. She felt reassured by his presence, yet there was a part of her that dreaded what might come next. She had seen her father handle difficult situations before, but this was different, this was personal. Marcus nodded slowly, taking in Peter's words with a calm that masked the fire simmering beneath his exterior. He placed a reassuring hand on Alyssa's shoulder, gently drawing her closer to him. So, because she's young and doesn't look like your usual clientele, you felt justified in treating her with suspicion and hostility. Peter's face flushed as he realized how his words sounded when repeated back to him. "I was just doing my job," he muttered, trying to defend himself. "We have to be vigilant. You never know who might be looking to take advantage." Marcus's eyes hardened. "Take advantage," he echoed, his tone sharper now, each word cutting through the air with precision. "Are you suggesting that my daughter, a child who came here with nothing but respect and admiration for this place, had any intention of taking advantage of your store?" The accusation, though calmly spoken, landed with force. Peter shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if looking for an escape route. He could sense the weight of Marcus's words pressing down on him, and a part of him began to realize that he might have miscalculated. But his pride, and perhaps a sense of entitlement, wouldn't allow him to back down completely. "I'm just saying, it's our policy to monitor anyone who might seem out of place," Peter stammered, his voice growing weaker as he spoke. The words were barely out of his mouth before he realized the implication, and the look on Marcus's face confirmed his mistake. "Out of place," Marcus repeated, his voice now as cold as steel. He let the words hang in the air, allowing the full weight of their meaning to sink in. "Tell me, Mr. Collins." "Peter Collins," the salesman replied, his confidence visibly eroding under Marcus's gaze. "Tell me, Mr. Collins," Marcus continued, "what about my daughter makes her out of place in your establishment?" Peter opened his mouth, but no words came out. He felt trapped, cornered by the sheer intensity of Marcus's questioning. The other customers in the store were beginning to take notice, their gazes subtly shifting towards the unfolding scene. The quiet murmur of conversation around them died down as the tension in the room became palpable. Seeing Peter's hesitation, Marcus continued, his voice calm, but with an underlying edge that conveyed his simmering anger. "You saw a young black girl in your store, and instead of offering assistance, you immediately assumed the worst. You didn't see a customer, you saw a threat. Isn't that right, Mr. Collins?" Peter's face went a shade paler as he stammered, I didn't mean it like that." He glanced around, aware that they were drawing attention. "I was just trying to keep things in order. You have to understand, we've had incidents before." Incidents, Marcus's voice cut through Peter's excuses like a knife. "So, based on incidents, you think it's acceptable to judge someone solely on their appearance? Tell me, Mr. Collins, is that the training you received here? Is this store known for assuming guilt before innocence?" Peter swallowed hard, realizing that there was no graceful way out of this. He could feel the judgment of not only Marcus but the other customers, who were now openly watching the exchange. He had no defense left, nothing he could say that wouldn't further incriminate him. Marcus took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "Mr. Collins, let me be very clear. My daughter came here today to find something special, a gift for her mother. She came here with the purest intentions, and you tried to strip that from her based on your own biases. You humiliated her and made her feel unwelcome in a place where any decent person would have simply offered her help." Peter was silent, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. He wanted to protest, to argue, but he knew he was trapped. There was no way to argue against what he had done without further exposing his prejudice. Finally, Marcus took a breath, his expression softening slightly as he looked down at Alyssa, who was now standing straighter, her own confidence bolstered by her father's presence. He gave her a gentle nod, silently reassuring her that she was not alone, that he was here to protect her dignity. Turning back to Peter, Marcus spoke with a voice that was both calm and commanding. "I would like to speak to your manager," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And I suggest you prepare yourself to explain your actions. Because, Mr. Collins, today is the day you learn what real standards look like." Peter, defeated and visibly shaken, gave a reluctant nod and turned to fetch the manager, realizing too late that his own standards had just been shattered. Peter Collins turned away from Marcus and Alyssa, his face flushed and his hands trembling slightly as he walked toward the back office to summon the manager. The usual confidence he carried like a badge of honor had dissolved, leaving him visibly rattled. For the first time in years, he felt truly vulnerable, caught in a situation where his own biases had been laid bare, and there was no easy escape. Marcus and Alyssa stood quietly, watching him leave. Alyssa looked up at her father, a glimmer of awe mixed with relief in her eyes. She'd never seen her father handle a situation like this before, not just standing up for her, but doing so with a calm authority that seemed to command respect without raising his voice. She felt a surge of pride, but also a sense of newfound strength within herself. With her father by her side, she didn't feel quite as small or as out of place. After a few moments, Peter returned, accompanied by the store manager, a well-dressed woman in her 40s with a reserved yet polished appearance. Her name tag read Megan Bradley, and she radiated the kind of poised professionalism that one would expect in a high-end boutique. She had a courteous smile plastered on her face, but the tension in her eyes revealed her awareness of the gravity of the situation. She knew that any mishandling could spell trouble for the store's reputation. "Good afternoon, sir. My name is Megan Bradley, the manager here. I understand there was an issue with one of our staff members." Megan's voice was smooth and carefully measured, each word selected to diffuse tension without fully acknowledging fault. She looked at Marcus with a polite, almost diplomatic expression, as if trying to gauge his reaction before proceeding. Marcus nodded, his gaze steady and unflinching. "Yes, there was indeed an issue, Ms. Bradley. Your employee, Mr. Collins here, saw fit to treat my daughter with suspicion and hostility from the moment she walked in. He assumed, without any reason, that she was here to cause trouble simply because she didn't fit his perception of what your usual clientele looks like." Megan's eyes flickered briefly toward Peter, who shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny. She took a small breath, clearly weighing her words. "I apologize if there was any misunderstanding, Mr. Johnson." "Marcus Johnson," he replied, his tone courteous but firm. "Mr. Johnson," Megan continued smoothly, "I assure you we hold all our customers in the highest regard. If there was any misunderstanding, I'm sure it was not intentional. I believe Mr. Collins was simply following protocol to ensure the safety and security of our merchandise." Marcus's jaw tightened slightly at her carefully crafted response. He could see that she was attempting to defuse the situation without fully addressing the underlying issue. But he wasn't about to let this slide with a surface-level apology. "Protocol," Marcus repeated, his tone sharpening. "Ms. Bradley, let me ask you this: does your protocol specifically include targeting young black girls as potential threats? Or is that something Mr. Collins decided on his own?" Megan hesitated, taken aback by the directness of his question. She glanced at Peter, who looked increasingly uncomfortable, then returned her gaze to Marcus. "We don't discriminate against any of our customers, Mr. Johnson. That is absolutely against our policy. I can assure you that Mr. Collins's actions were meant to uphold the standards of the store, not to single anyone out unfairly." "Then perhaps we should clarify what these standards are," Marcus replied, his voice cool and unwavering. Because from where I stand, it seems that your employee felt entitled to pass judgment on my daughter based solely on her appearance. He made her feel unwelcome, humiliated her, and tarnished the image of your establishment. Is that what you consider upholding standards? Megan's polished demeanor faltered for a moment, the weight of Marcus's words settling over her. She shifted slightly, glancing at Peter again, who stood stiffly by her side, his face an unreadable mask. She realized that her usual methods of deflecting blame might not work here. Marcus was not a man who would be easily placated. "Mr. Johnson," she began, choosing her words carefully, "I apologize if your daughter was made to feel uncomfortable. That was certainly not our intention, and we regret any distress caused. Perhaps we can find a way to move past this. We value all our customers. And I would be more than happy to offer a discount on any item you wish to purchase as a gesture of goodwill." Marcus shook his head, a slight smile that did not reach his eyes appearing on his face. "Ms. Bradley, I appreciate the offer, but this is not about discounts or appeasement. This is about accountability. I came here with my daughter so she could experience the joy of choosing something special for her mother. Instead, she was treated like a potential criminal, dismissed and belittled by someone you've entrusted to represent this store." Alyssa squeezed her father's hand, grateful for his words but still feeling a knot of anxiety as she watched the confrontation unfold. She glanced at Peter, who looked more and more uncomfortable, his expression shifting between defensiveness and embarrassment. She could tell that, for the first time, he was beginning to understand the impact of his actions. Megan exhaled softly, clearly beginning to sense the depth of Marcus's frustration. "Mr. Johnson, please understand that we take situations like this very seriously. I will be discussing this incident with Mr. Collins to ensure that it does not happen again. We do not condone any form of discrimination or inappropriate behavior from our staff." Marcus crossed his arms, his gaze still steady. "I don't doubt that you'll have a conversation with him, Ms. Bradley. But that doesn't solve the underlying issue. This isn't about protocol or misunderstandings. This is about ingrained biases that people like Mr. Collins here carry with them. Biases that harm individuals like my daughter who simply wanted to be treated with respect." Megan's carefully composed expression finally began to crack, her shoulders tensing as she realized the situation was far from a typical customer complaint. This was a moment that demanded real accountability, not just polite apologies. Peter, unable to remain silent any longer, cleared his throat and took a step forward. "With all due respect, Mr. Johnson, I was only doing my job. I thought she looked suspicious. It's part of my responsibility to watch out for anything unusual, and I acted on my instincts." "Your instincts," Marcus echoed, his voice icy. "And tell me, Mr. Collins, what exactly about my daughter struck you as suspicious? Was it her appearance? Her age? Or was it simply the fact that she didn't look like you?" Peter shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Megan for support, but she remained silent, her face impassive. The weight of Marcus's question hung heavily in the air, and Peter found himself at a loss for words. He had no valid reason, no justification that wouldn't expose his own prejudices. Finally, after a painfully long pause, Peter muttered, I suppose I misjudged. I didn't mean to offend anyone." Marcus shook his head slowly, his gaze never leaving Peter's face. "Misjudged? Mr. Collins, this isn't about a simple misjudgment. This is about the harm you inflicted on a young girl who did nothing to deserve it. My daughter came here with excitement and innocence, and you crushed that with your baseless suspicions. Do you understand the damage that causes?" Peter lowered his gaze, visibly chastened, but Marcus wasn't finished. He turned back to Megan, his tone shifting from accusatory to resolute. MS. Bradley, I'm not interested in empty apologies or superficial gestures. I want to know what steps this store is willing to take to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again to my daughter or to anyone else who might not fit Mr. Collins's narrow view of who belongs here. Megan looked from Marcus to Peter, understanding that she was at a crossroads. She could continue to dance around the issue, or she could confront it head-on. With a deep breath, she nodded slowly. Mr. Johnson, she said, her voice steady, you're absolutely right. This situation has highlighted a serious problem, and it's clear that we need to address it. I will personally ensure that Mr. Collins receives further training on customer interaction and implicit bias. Additionally, I will be implementing a mandatory sensitivity training program for all of our staff to prevent this kind of behavior in the future. Marcus considered her words, his gaze sharp and evaluating. He could see that Megan was making an effort, but he wanted more than promises. Training is a good start, he replied. But it's not enough. I suggest that your store takes it a step further and holds periodic reviews of staff conduct. Bias doesn't disappear after a single session. It takes consistent effort to unlearn harmful behaviors. Megan nodded again, visibly taking his words to heart. Thank you for your suggestion, Mr. Johnson. I will ensure that we incorporate regular assessments as part of our ongoing staff development. I understand that actions speak louder than words, and I want you to know that we are committed to making meaningful changes. Peter, now visibly remorseful, looked at Marcus with a strained expression. Mr. Johnson, I realize I made a mistake. I'm sorry for the way I treated your daughter. It was wrong, and I'll do everything I can to make it right. Marcus regarded him silently for a moment, then nodded curtly. I appreciate the apology, Mr. Collins. But remember, apologies are only the first step. Real change requires action. Turning back to Alyssa, Marcus placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Are you ready to find that special gift for your mother? He asked gently, his voice softening. Alyssa nodded, a faint smile returning to her face. She felt a renewed sense of pride and confidence, knowing that her father had not only defended her, but had also used this experience to create a teachable moment for everyone involved. As they walked away from Peter and Megan, the store felt different to Alyssa. She no longer felt small or out of place. Instead, she felt empowered, carrying with her the knowledge that she had every right to be here and anywhere else she chose to go. Marcus and Alyssa walked together to another part of the store, leaving the chastened Peter and contemplative Megan in their wake. But even as they tried to refocus on the original purpose of their visit, finding a special gift for Alyssa's mother, Marcus could sense his daughter's lingering unease. Alyssa was silent, her eyes scanning the displays almost mechanically, without the enthusiasm she had walked in with. The spark in her gaze had dimmed, replaced by an uncertainty that Marcus knew all too well. He leaned down slightly, keeping his voice low and gentle. Hey, are you okay? He asked, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Alyssa looked up at him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and lingering sadness. I'm okay, Daddy. It's just, I don't get why he was like that. I just wanted to pick out something nice for Mum, but he acted like I was doing something wrong just by being here. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding her confusion and hurt. This was the part of growing up that he had hoped she wouldn't have to face yet, but life had brought it to her doorstep. As much as he wished he could shield her from such experiences, he knew that moments like these were inevitable. What mattered was how she learned to face them. Some people judge others based on things that don't matter, like how they look or how old they are, he explained gently, choosing his words carefully. It's unfair, and it's wrong, but sometimes that's the way they see the world. But remember, Alyssa, their judgment doesn't define you. It only shows who they are. Alyssa absorbed his words, nodding slightly as she processed them. Marcus saw the faintest hint of a smile return to her lips, and he felt a wave of relief. Still, he could tell that the experience had left a mark, a small but significant change in her perception of the world. Before they could resume browsing, Megan approached them again, her face set with a newfound resolve. Behind her, Peter stood at a distance, his expression subdued as he watched them. It was clear that Megan had spoken to him privately, and while he still looked uncomfortable, there was a glint of introspection in his gaze. "Mr. Johnson, Alyssa," Megan began, her tone sincere, "I wanted to personally thank you both for helping us recognize an issue that we need to address here. This store prides itself on being welcoming to all customers, but today's incident has shown me that we have some work to do to make sure that's truly the case." Marcus gave her a respectful nod. "Thank you, Ms. Bradley. I appreciate your commitment to making changes, and I hope those changes are lasting." Megan took a breath, clearly preparing herself to go beyond a mere apology. "If you're willing, I would like to offer you both the opportunity to sit down with me and discuss ways we can improve our customer experience and staff training. I believe your insight, as a lawyer and as someone who's experienced this personally, would be invaluable in helping us create a more inclusive environment." The offer took Marcus by surprise. He hadn't expected Megan to extend an invitation for real dialogue and change, but he could see that she was sincere. Alyssa looked up at him, her eyes wide with curiosity and a hint of excitement, as if she were seeing her father in a new light. Marcus turned to her, silently asking if she was comfortable with the idea. Alyssa nodded slowly, her curiosity outweighing her initial discomfort. She wanted to understand more, to see how her father handled situations like this in a constructive way. "All right, Miss Bradley," Marcus replied, his tone thoughtful. "If you're truly committed to change, I'd be happy to sit down and discuss this with you. But I want Alyssa to be a part of that conversation. She deserves to have her voice heard." Megan smiled, clearly appreciative of Marcus's approach. "Of course. Let's head to our private lounge area, where we can talk more comfortably." She led them to a quiet, elegantly furnished lounge at the back of the store. Soft leather armchairs were arranged around a low-glass table, and tasteful artwork adorned the walls. It was a space designed to convey warmth and exclusivity, and it contrasted sharply with the tense atmosphere that had just unfolded in the main showroom. They settled into the chairs, with Megan and Peter on one side and Marcus and Alyssa on the other. The air was thick with a mixture of discomfort and the possibility of reconciliation. Peter's face was tight with apprehension, while Megan maintained a composed expression, though her eyes revealed a genuine desire to listen. Marcus looked at Peter for a moment before addressing the room. "I want to make one thing very clear," he began. "This isn't just about what happened today. It's about the underlying mindset that allowed it to happen. People like Alyssa shouldn't have to prove they belong in spaces like this. The default assumption should be respect, not suspicion." Peter shifted uncomfortably but nodded, clearly absorbing Marcus's words. I realized that I misjudged her. I let my own assumptions cloud my judgment. It's not something I'm proud of, and I'm sorry for the pain I caused." Megan chimed in, reinforcing Peter's statement. "What happened today is a wake-up call for all of us. Biases can be subtle, and sometimes we don't even realize they're influencing our actions. But that's no excuse. We need to be proactive in recognizing and addressing them." Marcus acknowledged her words with a nod. "That's true. Bias often operates beneath the surface, shaping our actions in ways we don't fully understand. It's easy to fall into those patterns without even noticing, but it's also our responsibility to challenge them actively. Alyssa, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. Her voice was soft but steady. I just wanted to feel like I belonged here. I didn't come here to do anything wrong. I just wanted to pick something special for my mum. Her words hung in the air, simple but powerful. Peter looked down, visibly moved, while Megan's expression softened with empathy. In that moment, Alyssa's vulnerability and sincerity underscored the human cost of prejudice in a way that no statistics or policies ever could. Megan leaned forward, her voice gentle. Alyssa, thank you for sharing that with us. I'm so sorry that we failed to make you feel welcome. I promise that we'll work hard to make sure no one else has to feel the way you did. Alyssa managed a small smile, glancing at her father, who gave her a reassuring nod. She felt a surge of pride, not only in herself for speaking up, but also in the way her father had taught her to handle the situation with grace. Marcus turned his attention back to Megan. If you're serious about change, I have a few suggestions that might help. First, regular sensitivity training is essential, but it can't just be a one-time event. It needs to be ongoing, with periodic assessments to make sure those lessons are actually being applied. Megan listened intently, nodding along. Absolutely. I agree that training should be a continuous process. We want to make sure that our staff not only understands these principles intellectually, but also feels them on a personal level. And beyond training. Marcus continued, I think it's important to create a culture of accountability. Employees need to know that they'll be held responsible for their actions, and that any form of discrimination or bias will have consequences. It's not about punishment, it's about maintaining standards that reflect the values of respect and inclusion. Peter, who had remained mostly silent, finally spoke up. His voice was subdued but sincere. Mr. Johnson, I understand now that I have a lot to learn. I see now how my actions impacted Alyssa, and I know that I can't undo that. But I want you to know that I'm willing to change, to do better. I'm not proud of what happened, but I hope I can make amends. Marcus studied Peter, sensing the genuine remorse in his voice. He could see that Peter was struggling with the realization of his own biases, grappling with the discomfort that came with facing his own flaws. This wasn't an easy journey, but Marcus knew that the first step toward change was often the hardest. I appreciate your honesty, Peter Marcus replied, his tone measured but encouraging. Acknowledging your mistake is important, but true change comes from commitment. I hope that this experience will serve as a reminder to treat every person with the respect they deserve. Peter nodded, his gaze filled with a newfound humility. For the first time, he seemed to genuinely grasp the weight of his actions, understanding that his behavior had real consequences, especially for a young girl who had done nothing wrong. Megan looked between Marcus, Alyssa, and Peter, sensing the shift in the room's energy. Thank you, Mr. Johnson, Alyssa, and Peter. I think today has been a learning experience for all of us. I'm committed to ensuring that this store becomes a place where everyone feels welcome, and I appreciate the opportunity to learn from your perspective. Marcus nodded, feeling a sense of closure. The conversation had brought the issue to the surface, forcing everyone to confront the biases that often went unspoken. While he knew this wasn't the end of the struggle, it was a meaningful step in the right direction. Standing up, Marcus extended his hand to Megan, who shook it firmly. Then, he turned to Peter, offering him the same gesture. Peter accepted the handshake, his grip firm but respectful, and a silent understanding passed between them. As Marcus and Alyssa prepared to leave the lounge, he looked down at his daughter, giving her a warm smile. Are you ready to pick out that gift now? He asked gently. Alyssa's eyes sparkled with a renewed sense of confidence. Yes, Daddy. I think I am. Together, they walked back to the main showroom with Alyssa holding her head high. For the first time since they'd entered, she felt like she truly belonged. And in that moment, both father and daughter knew that this was a day neither of them would forget. Marcus and Alyssa stepped back onto the showroom floor, feeling a sense of accomplishment and relief after the emotionally charged conversation in the lounge. Alyssa's earlier apprehension seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a newfound confidence. She held her father's hand, feeling a stronger connection with him, grateful for his unwavering support and the dignity with which he handled the confrontation. But as they resumed their search for the perfect gift, Marcus couldn't shake a feeling of unfinished business. Despite Megan's assurances and Peter's apology, he knew that a single conversation wouldn't erase years of bias or change deeply ingrained perceptions overnight. It was a step forward, yes, but he also understood that true change required continuous commitment, especially in environments like this boutique, where appearance and social status often dictated treatment. Just as Alyssa's eyes landed on a delicate necklace that seemed perfect, the door to the store swung open, and in walked a man with a commanding presence. Tall and meticulously dressed, he carried himself with an air of authority. His piercing gaze swept across the showroom, immediately landing on Megan, who, noticing his arrival, seemed to stiffen slightly. The man strode over to her with an expression of calm control, speaking in a low but firm tone. Though Marcus and Alyssa couldn't hear their conversation from where they stood, it was evident that this man held a position of influence, likely higher than Megan's. She gestured subtly in the direction of Marcus and Alyssa, and the man's gaze followed her gesture. He observed them with a look of curiosity and something close to intrigue, as if trying to assess the situation before approaching. The man nodded to Megan, signaling for her to stay back, then walked toward Marcus and Alyssa, his expression inscrutable. As he approached, Marcus felt Alyssa's hand tense slightly, her fingers tightening around his. He gave her a reassuring squeeze, silently conveying that whatever came next, they would face it together. "Good afternoon," the man greeted, his voice smooth but edged with a formality that implied authority. "My name is Richard Hayes. I'm the regional director for this boutique chain. I understand there was an issue involving one of our employees and your daughter." Marcus nodded, his gaze steady. "Yes, Mr. Hayes. That's correct. My daughter was subjected to an unwarranted and humiliating experience due to an employee's bias. We've had a conversation with the store manager, Megan, and with the employee in question. But I believe the issue we're discussing here goes beyond a single incident." Hayes inclined his head, acknowledging Marcus's words. "I see. I've been informed of the situation, and I came here personally to ensure that it's resolved appropriately. I'd like to offer my sincerest apologies on behalf of our company. We take pride in providing a welcoming and inclusive experience for all of our customers. And what happened today does not reflect our values." Alyssa looked up at Hayes, studying his face as he spoke. There was something about him that felt polished, like a well-practiced presentation. Marcus noticed this too, sensing that Hayes was adept at handling complaints, but perhaps less experienced in addressing the underlying problems that caused them. "Apologies are a start, Mr. Hayes," Marcus replied, his tone respectful yet firm. "But we both know that words alone don't make lasting changes. I appreciate that you've come here to address this, but I want to know what steps your company plans to take to prevent this from happening to other customers in the future." Hayes nodded, maintaining a composed expression. "I understand, Mr. Johnson. We're committed to implementing additional training for our staff to address issues of bias and discrimination. As I mentioned, this incident does not align with our values, and we're dedicated to making sure all of our employees uphold the highest standards of respect and professionalism." Marcus narrowed his eyes slightly, reading between the lines. With respect, Mr. Hayes, I've heard similar promises from other companies in the past. What I want to know is, how are you planning to hold employees accountable if they don't meet those standards? This isn't just about training. It's about creating a culture where behavior like this isn't tolerated. Hayes seemed to consider Marcus's words, a faint flicker of annoyance crossing his face before he regained his calm demeanor. We do have policies in place to address issues of misconduct, Mr. Johnson. Any employee found to be acting inappropriately would be subject to disciplinary measures. However, as I'm sure you understand, we cannot divulge the specifics of those measures to customers. Marcus raised an eyebrow, sensing the underlying defensiveness in Hayes's response. I'm not asking for specifics, Mr. Hayes. I'm asking for assurance that your company is committed to more than just surface-level fixes. Bias can't be solved by a training session or a policy update alone. It requires ongoing commitment and a willingness to look at uncomfortable truths. Hayes's composure faltered slightly, as though Marcus had struck a nerve. He glanced at Megan, who stood nearby, her expression tense as she observed the exchange. Marcus could see that both Hayes and Megan were struggling to find the balance between addressing his concerns and maintaining the polished image of their brand. Mr. Johnson, Hayes began, his voice taking on a slightly harder edge. I assure you, we take customer concerns very seriously, and we value your feedback. But we also have a reputation to uphold, and I would appreciate it if we could handle this matter with discretion. Alyssa, sensing the tension in her father's stance, looked up at him, her expression a mixture of confusion and concern. She could tell that something had shifted in the conversation, that her father's patience was wearing thin. Marcus took a slow, steady breath before responding. Discretion is one thing, Mr. Hayes. Avoiding accountability is another. I'm not here to make demands or threaten your reputation. I'm here to ensure that what happened to my daughter doesn't happen to anyone else. Hayes's jaw tightened subtly, his polished facade beginning to crack under the pressure. He glanced at Peter, who was standing in the background, watching the interaction with a mixture of regret and defensiveness. It was clear that Hayes was becoming uncomfortable with the way Marcus was challenging him, but he was reluctant to lose control of the narrative. Mr. Johnson, Hayes said finally, his tone still calm but with an underlying tension, we will take all necessary steps to address this issue. I can assure you that the employee in question will be given additional training, and we will review our policies to make sure they are comprehensive. Marcus nodded, though he sensed that Hayes's words were more about placating him than effecting real change. But he also knew that pushing further in this setting might only make things worse, especially with Alyssa present. For now, he decided to let the conversation rest, but he made a mental note to follow up and ensure that Hayes's promises weren't just empty words. Thank you for your time, Mr. Hayes, Marcus replied, his tone courteous but resolute. I hope that our conversation today leads to meaningful improvements in how your company approaches these situations. Hayes gave a tight nod, clearly eager to wrap up the conversation. Of course, Mr. Johnson. And please feel free to reach out if you have any further concerns. With that, Hayes turned to Megan, giving her a subtle nod before stepping back, effectively ending the discussion. Marcus watched him walk away, a mixture of frustration and determination brewing within him. He knew that true change would require more than a polished apology from a regional director. Turning to Alyssa, he gave her a warm smile. Are you still up for finding something special for Mum? Alyssa nodded, her earlier enthusiasm returning as she refocused on her original mission. Together, they continued browsing, and after a few more minutes, Alyssa's eyes landed on a delicate silver necklace with a small sapphire pendant. It was simple yet elegant, and she could already picture her mother's smile when she saw it. "This one," Alyssa said, her voice filled with excitement. "I think Mum will love it." Marcus smiled, feeling a sense of closure as he watched his daughter's joy return. "It's perfect," he agreed. "Let's get it wrapped up." They approached the checkout counter, where a new sales associate, a young woman with a warm smile, greeted them. Unlike Peter, she seemed genuinely welcoming, treating them with the same respect she would afford any other customer. As she wrapped the necklace in an elegant box, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on how different the experience could have been if every employee carried the same openness and professionalism. When the transaction was complete, Marcus and Alyssa thanked the associate and began to make their way out of the store. As they reached the door, Marcus felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Peter standing behind him, his face filled with remorse. "Mr. Johnson," Alyssa, Peter began, his voice quiet. "I just wanted to apologize again, sincerely. I know that my actions hurt you and I'm committed to doing better. Today was a lesson I won't forget." Marcus regarded him carefully, sensing the genuine regret in Peter's voice. "Thank you, Peter," he replied, his tone measured but kind. "I hope you take this experience to heart, not just for us, but for anyone you may encounter in the future." Peter nodded, visibly moved. "I will. I promise." With that, Marcus gave him a respectful nod, then turned to Alyssa. "Ready to go?" Alyssa smiled, feeling a sense of relief as they finally stepped out of the boutique and into the bright afternoon light. She took a deep breath, savoring the fresh air and the freedom from the tension of the past hour. As they walked through the bustling shopping district, Marcus wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Dad," Alyssa said after a moment, her voice thoughtful, "thank you for standing up for me. I know it wasn't easy." Marcus looked down at her, his expression filled with pride. "You're worth every moment of it, Alyssa. And remember, you deserve to be treated with respect, no matter where you are or who you're with." Alyssa nodded, feeling a renewed sense of confidence as she walked beside her father. She knew that there would be other challenges ahead, but with his guidance, she felt prepared to face them with strength and dignity. Together, they walked away from the store, leaving behind a lesson that would linger in the minds of everyone involved for a long time to come. Marcus and Alyssa walked down the lively streets of the shopping district, both feeling a mix of relief and quiet satisfaction. They had not only found a gift, but had also confronted a painful, complex issue head-on. For Alyssa, it was an experience that opened her eyes to a harsh reality, but it also showed her the strength and dignity of her father's approach. She knew this day would stay with her for a long time, and she felt a surge of pride knowing her father was willing to stand up, not just for her but for fairness and respect for everyone. As they approached their car, Marcus felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. Glancing down, he saw an unfamiliar number. He hesitated but decided to answer, his curiosity piqued by the day's unusual events. "Hello, this is Marcus Johnson," he answered, his voice steady. "Mr. Johnson, this is Richard Hayes, the regional director who had met them at the boutique." His voice carried a mixture of urgency and respect. "I realize our earlier conversation may not have fully conveyed our commitment to addressing the concerns you raised. After some reflection, I'd like to invite you and your daughter to meet with me and our company's diversity and inclusion team. We're planning to implement some changes, and we believe your insight would be invaluable." Marcus paused, absorbing the unexpected offer. He hadn't anticipated hearing from Hayes again, let alone an invitation for further dialogue. "Mr. Hayes, I appreciate the outreach," he replied, casting a glance at Alyssa, who looked at him curiously. "If this is a genuine effort to make real change, then yes, we'd be open to a discussion." "It is," Mr. Johnson, Hayes replied. a slight edge of sincerity breaking through his usual formality. "We'll follow up with an official invitation and schedule. Thank you for considering it." Marcus ended the call, feeling a renewed sense of hope. The journey to real change was often long and arduous, but perhaps this was a step in the right direction. He shared the news with Alyssa, whose face lit up with excitement and pride. "Does that mean they're really going to listen to us, Dad?" she asked, her voice filled with optimism. Marcus smiled, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It sounds like they're willing to try, sweetheart, and that's already more than most places would do." As they got into the car and drove away, Marcus reflected on the day's events, the struggles, and the small but significant victories. In his heart, he hoped that his efforts would indeed lead to meaningful changes within the company and perhaps set a standard for others to follow. Days later, Marcus and Alyssa returned to the boutique, not as customers this time, but as honored guests invited to a round-table discussion. When they arrived, they were led into a conference room where a diverse group of executives and employees, including Peter and Megan, sat waiting. Hayes was there as well, looking more composed but with an air of respectful attentiveness that hadn't been as evident before. The atmosphere in the room was one of introspection and humility, and Marcus could tell that the events of that day had sparked a deeper conversation within the company. As the meeting began, Hayes introduced Marcus and Alyssa, highlighting their role in bringing attention to an important issue that the company needed to address. He spoke candidly about the importance of this discussion, acknowledging that it was well past time for them to examine their own biases and practices. "We're here today because Mr. Johnson reminded us of something crucial, that respect and dignity are not optional, they are fundamental," Hayes stated, his voice steady but filled with conviction. Marcus felt a sense of pride, not just for himself but for Alyssa, who had been the catalyst for this change. He glanced at her, and she gave him a small, encouraging smile, her eyes shining with confidence. One by one, the executives shared their perspectives on the need for a cultural shift within the company. They spoke of the importance of ongoing bias training, fair treatment, and holding all employees accountable to the values of respect and inclusivity. As each person spoke, Marcus could see genuine commitment in their words, a willingness to take real action rather than just issue hollow statements. When it was his turn to speak, Marcus chose his words carefully, his tone calm but powerful. "Bias is like a shadow," he began. "It follows us around, shapes our actions in ways we don't always realize. But when we shine a light on it, we have a chance to confront it and make different choices. It's not enough to talk about respect and inclusivity, we have to live it, breathe it, embody it in everything we do." He paused, looking around the room, making eye contact with each person, including Peter and Megan. "I hope that my daughter's experience has shown all of you what's at stake. If we want to create a world where everyone feels welcome, where dignity is a right, not a privilege, then we have to be willing to do the hard work of self-reflection and change." Alyssa, inspired by her father's words, spoke up as well. "It's important to remember that people come to places like this because they feel excited, happy, and they want to share that with someone they love. I wanted to get something special for my mum, but instead, I felt scared, like I didn't belong. I hope that from now on, kids like me can come here and feel safe, no matter who they are or where they come from." Her words were simple but deeply moving, resonating with everyone in the room. Peter, visibly moved, spoke up with a voice filled with remorse. "I know I can't change what happened that day," he said, his tone thick with emotion. "But I promised to work on myself, to understand the biases I carry and make sure they don't affect how I treat people." As the meeting concluded, there was a palpable sense of renewal and commitment in the air. The company had not only acknowledged the issue but had taken the first steps toward creating a lasting impact, driven by the voices of Marcus and Alyssa. When the meeting ended, Hayes approached Marcus and Alyssa, his expression one of gratitude and respect. "Mr. Johnson, Alyssa, thank you. Today was the beginning of something important for us, and we owe it to you both." Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It was a team effort, Mr. Hayes. I'm just glad we had the chance to help make a difference." As they left the building, Alyssa walked beside her father, her head held high, her heart filled with pride. She understood now the power of her voice, the strength that came from standing up for what was right. And as they stepped back into the bright daylight, she felt a sense of hope for herself, for her family, and for all the people who would one day walk into that boutique and feel, truly, that they belonged. As Marcus and Alyssa stepped out of the conference room and into the bright afternoon sunlight, there was a profound sense of relief and fulfillment between them. Alyssa felt as if a weight had lifted from her shoulders. The experience in the store had started as a moment of hurt and confusion, but now, walking beside her father, she felt stronger and more self-assured than ever. She had witnessed the power of standing up for herself and the impact of addressing wrongs with grace and conviction. Marcus looked down at his daughter, a proud smile crossing his face. "How do you feel, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice warm and encouraging. Alyssa thought for a moment, a gentle smile forming. "I feel proud, I guess," she said, glancing back toward the store. "Proud that we did something to help make it better, so no one else has to go through what we did." Marcus nodded, his eyes filled with admiration. "You should feel proud. You handled everything with so much courage, Alyssa. Not everyone would have done that. You helped people see things they might never have understood on their own." They walked in silence for a few moments, each of them reflecting on the day. Marcus knew that his daughter had learned something powerful, something that would stay with her long after they left the boutique. He could see a new spark in her, a resilience that would carry her forward. This experience, though painful, had become a turning point in her understanding of the world and her place within it. As they continued down the street, Marcus's phone buzzed once more. Glancing at the screen, he saw an email notification from Richard Hayes, the regional director they had met with. Curious, he stopped for a moment, opened the email, and read through the message. A small, satisfied smile appeared on his face as he read the details. "What is it?" Dad, Alyssa asked, noticing his expression. "It's from Mr. Hayes," Marcus replied, showing her the email. "He wanted to let us know that the company has formally implemented new training programs and a policy of regular reviews to ensure that bias has no place in their stores. They're calling it the Johnson Initiative, named after you." Alyssa's eyes widened, her mouth dropping open in surprise. "They named it after me," she whispered, a sense of wonder filling her voice. Marcus nodded, his pride evident. "Yes, after you. Because you were brave enough to speak up, to share how you felt, and to let others see the impact of their actions. It's a small step, but it's a powerful one. And now, every new employee who joins their team will learn about the importance of respect, empathy, and understanding." Alyssa looked up at her father, tears of happiness forming in her eyes. She realized that this wasn't just about one incident in a store, it was about changing something bigger, something that would make a difference for other kids who might one day find themselves in a similar situation. She wrapped her arms around her father, hugging him tightly, feeling a deep sense of gratitude and pride. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered. "For everything." Marcus hugged her back, his heart full. "No, thank you, Alyssa. You taught them something that no one else could have. And you taught me too. I'm so proud of you." As they continued their walk, Alyssa felt a lightness she hadn't felt before. She knew that her voice had power, that speaking up for herself, and for others could bring real change. Her father had shown her how to handle difficult situations with dignity and strength, and she carried that lesson with her as they walked through the city together. In the following days, Alyssa returned to her normal routine, but something in her had changed. She felt more confident, more certain of her place in the world. When friends at school asked about her weekend, she told them about what had happened, sharing her story with a quiet strength. She knew now that standing up for herself wasn't just something she could do, it was something she must do, for herself and for others. The boutique's changes, now called the Johnson Initiative, began to ripple outward, affecting not just the employees but the community as a whole. Word of the policy shift spread, and soon other businesses began to take notice. Inspired by Alyssa's bravery and Marcus's insistence on accountability, similar programs began to emerge across the city, creating a wave of awareness and empathy that hadn't been there before. Months later, Alyssa and her family returned to the boutique, this time as honored guests. The store had undergone changes not just in policy but in atmosphere. There was a new warmth to the place, a welcoming energy that seemed to touch everyone who walked through its doors. Employees greeted them with genuine smiles, and a new sense of respect and kindness permeated the air. Peter, the salesman who had once looked at Alyssa with suspicion, was among the first to welcome them. He had undergone the training and had spent months reflecting on his own biases. Now, he greeted Alyssa with kindness, his eyes filled with respect. It was clear that he too had changed, that the experience had transformed him in ways he hadn't expected. "Welcome back," Alyssa Peters said with a sincere smile. "It's an honor to have you here." Alyssa smiled, feeling the sincerity in his words. She knew that people could change, that even the hardest hearts could soften with time and understanding. And in that moment she felt a quiet sense of victory, not just for herself but for everyone who had ever felt unseen or out of place. As they left the store, Alyssa looked up at her father, a confident smile on her face. She knew now that her voice mattered, that her actions could make a difference. And as she walked hand in hand with her father, she felt ready to face whatever challenges life might bring, knowing that she had the strength to stand up, to speak out, and to make a change.